There is a shift happening in the global economy right now that most people still do not fully understand. On the surface, the headlines this week looked simple. Donald Trump flew to Beijing. China agreed to buy Boeing aircraft. American media framed it as a diplomatic and economic victory. But beneath those headlines sits a much bigger story. A story about industrial power, supply chains, geopolitical leverage, and the quiet restructuring of the global trade system itself. Because while Washington was celebrating a possible Boeing breakthrough in China, Canada was quietly building something far more strategic. And the deeper you look into these two stories side by side, the more they reveal something uncomfortable about the direction of the world economy. Not 5 years from now, right now. The old system, the system where America sat unquestionably at the center of global trade, is beginning to fracture. And the countries adapting fastest to that reality may not be the countries most people expect. Let's start in Beijing. This week, Donald Trump arrived in China alongside one of the most powerful corporate delegations America has sent abroad in years. The Boeing CEO was there. Executives connected to finance and manufacturing were there. This was not just diplomacy. This was economic theater. The goal was obvious. Show the world that America could still negotiate massive deals directly with China, despite years of trade wars, tariffs, sanctions, and geopolitical hostility. Then came the announcement. Trump appeared on television and said Xi Jinping had agreed to purchase 200 Boeing jets. Immediately, headlines exploded across global media. Trump secures major Boeing deal. China reopens to Boeing. American manufacturing wins big. And for a moment, it looked like exactly the kind of symbolic victory Washington desperately wanted. Because Boeing's situation inside China has become one of the clearest symbols of America's broader economic struggle. For nearly a decade, Boeing has steadily lost ground in the Chinese market. First came the 737 MAX disasters. Then came the grounding crisis. Then the tariffs. Then worsening relations between Washington and Beijing. And while Boeing struggled through political and regulatory chaos, Airbus quietly moved in and took the market. This part is critical to understand. China is not just another aviation market. China is expected to become the largest commercial aviation market on Earth within the next 2 decades. That means whoever dominates Chinese aircraft demand could dominate global aviation manufacturing for generations. And during Boeing's absence, Airbus built relationships that may now be extremely difficult to break. Chinese airlines adapted to Airbus fleets. Maintenance systems adapted. Training systems adapted. Supply chains adapted. Pilot programs adapted. Entire aviation ecosystems shifted. This is how economic power changes in the modern world. Not through dramatic announcements overnight, but through slow industrial replacement over years. And that is why Wall Street reacted so strangely to Trump's Boeing announcement. Because investors immediately understood something most television audiences did not. A 200-plane announcement sounds massive, but relative to expectations, it may actually have been underwhelming. For months, analysts believed China could announce a far larger order. Some projections discussed 500 aircraft. Others mentioned even higher numbers once wide-body aircraft were included. So when Trump announced 200 big ones, investors started asking dangerous questions almost immediately. Was the agreement finalized? Were these binding contracts? Which airlines were involved? What aircraft models were included? What delivery timelines existed? What financing structures existed? And perhaps the most important question of all, had Boeing truly regained access to China, or was this mainly political optics? Because markets understand something politicians often ignore. Headlines are temporary. Industrial positioning is permanent. And that is where Canada enters this story. While global attention focused on Beijing, another event had already taken place quietly in Quebec. An event almost nobody in the United States paid attention to. Mark Carney had just overseen the largest order ever connected to Canadian-built commercial aircraft. 150 Airbus A220 jets. with options for another 150, roughly $19 billion in value. Now, at first glance, many Americans may not fully understand why that matters. But economically, it matters enormously. Because the A220 represents something much bigger than one airplane. It represents Canada's attempt to secure a permanent place inside the future global manufacturing economy. To understand why, we need to go backwards for a moment. Years ago, the aircraft now known as the Airbus A220 was originally designed by Bombardier in Canada under the name C-Series. At the time, it was considered one of the most ambitious aerospace projects in Canadian history. The goal was simple: build a next-generation narrow-body aircraft efficient enough to compete directly with Boeing and Airbus. But the costs exploded. Bombardier burned through billions of dollars trying to finish development. The company came dangerously close to collapse. Investors panicked. Governments intervened. Eventually, Quebec invested heavily just to keep the program alive. But even that was not enough. And then came one of the most controversial moments in Canadian industrial history. Bombardier essentially handed control of the aircraft program over to Airbus. At the time, critics called it a national humiliation. Canada had built revolutionary aerospace technology, only to surrender it to Europe. But history sometimes moves in strange directions. Because today, under Airbus management, the same aircraft program that once looked like a financial disaster is becoming one of the most strategically important manufacturing projects in North America. The Mirabel facility outside Montreal is no longer fighting for survival. It is expanding. And that matters because manufacturing capacity itself has become geopolitical power. This is one of the biggest economic shifts happening globally right now. Countries are realizing that controlling factories, supply chains, critical industries, and industrial ecosystems matters more than financial headlines. For decades, Western economies shifted heavily toward finance, technology, and services. Manufacturing was outsourced. Factories moved abroad. Supply chains globalized. That model worked efficiently when the world was stable. But geopolitical fragmentation changed everything. COVID changed everything. Trade wars changed everything. The Ukraine war changed everything. China-US tensions changed everything. Suddenly, governments realized something terrifying. If your critical industries exist somewhere else, your economic sovereignty becomes vulnerable. And now countries everywhere are racing to rebuild strategic manufacturing power. Semiconductors, energy, rare earth minerals, defense production, aerospace, all of it. This is why the Boeing-Airbus story matters so much. It is not really about airplanes. It is about industrial alignment inside the next phase of globalization. And Canada is positioning itself far more intelligently than many people realize. Because Canada understands something important. It cannot outmuscle the United States economically. It cannot compete with China on manufacturing scale. It cannot rival Europe's market size. But it can become strategically indispensable. That is the real game. Canada is quietly positioning itself as a stable industrial partner between major global blocs. Energy exports, critical minerals, aerospace manufacturing, agriculture, transportation corridors. These are long-term leverage points. And unlike the United States, Canada does not necessarily need to dominate headlines to benefit from global instability. In fact, being quieter may actually help. Because modern trade alliances are increasingly being built around predictability. And predictability has become valuable in a chaotic geopolitical environment. Now compare the optics of the two strategies we saw this week. The American approach was dramatic, highly personal, centered around political branding. The president announces a huge number on television. Media explodes. Markets react instantly. The Canadian approach looked completely different. No giant spectacle, no dramatic media performance, no nationalistic celebration. Just contracts, factories, supply chains, production schedules. And here is the dangerous part for Washington. The second strategy may ultimately prove more effective. Because long-term industrial influence is not built through television appearances. It is built through systems, factories, engineering networks, labor specialization, supplier ecosystems, infrastructure, trade reliability. These are the things that determine who actually controls economic power over decades. And the world is entering a period where those foundations matter more than ever. For years, America relied heavily on financial dominance and consumer market power. But the rest of the world has been adapting. China built manufacturing supremacy. Europe built regulatory influence. India is building demographic scale. Middle powers like Canada are positioning around strategic resources and industrial specialization. The global system is becoming multipolar economically, and that changes everything. Because once multiple industrial centers emerge, the United States no longer controls global trade flows the way it once did. That does not mean America collapses. Far from it. The U.S. economy remains incredibly powerful, but influence becomes more contested, more negotiated, more fragmented, more regionalized. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson hiding underneath this Boeing story. For decades, the world operated under assumptions that now appear less certain. America would always dominate global aviation. America would always sit at the center of trade. America would always define industrial direction. But history rarely moves in straight lines forever. Sometimes, systems slowly drift until suddenly everyone realizes the balance already changed years earlier. And we may now be entering one of those moments. Because while America was trying to reclaim lost ground in China this week, Canada was quietly securing the future of a factory already operating on its own soil. One side announced possibility, the other secured production. One side delivered headlines, the other delivered industrial momentum. And in the modern global economy, industrial momentum may matter far more. That is the real story unfolding here. Not simply Trump versus Carney, not Boeing versus Airbus, but the emergence of a new economic world where quieter countries, strategic manufacturing, and long-term industrial planning are beginning to challenge the old assumptions about who truly controls global trade. And the biggest shifts in history often begin exactly like this, quietly, until suddenly they are impossible to ignore.